Okay, this morning we're going to be back in Proverbs 26. The topics we're going to kind of cover today are going to be gossip, manipulation, deceit, flattery, and hypocrisy. Other than that, simple. So, somebody want to start with verse 17 of chapter 26? Rolling.
He who passes by and meddles in a quarrel, not his own, is like one who takes a dog by the ears.
Okay, well, if you know anything about dogs, you take them by the ears and there's going to be problems, right? They're going to bite, they're going to growl, there's going to be consequences for your actions. And so what Solomon is trying to say here is if you start meddling in other people's quarrels and get involved with that, there's going to be consequences. You'd be better off pulling on a dog's ear, right? So I thought it was interesting that Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, President LBJ, apparently back in the day, and this predates me, but apparently there was a photo circulating of him picking up his beagle by the ears. And people sent him this proverb, and they went ahead and took the leap of saying, not only are you doing this, but you're also doing this internationally with Vietnam, right? Because he was meddling in someone else's quarrel, and our boys were being sent to Vietnam. And history kind of repeats itself, right? We've been meddling in other foreign affairs, and to this day in Iran. So, the questions here are, where have you meddled in somewhere, and how did that turn out? And when should you do it, and how should you do it, is the question. Any thoughts there?
I am in a position a lot of times where I end up being a mediator. When I see that there's a situation maybe brewing between two employees, but they're not talking to each other, they're talking to other people, I'll pull them into a room privately, and I can be the third party and say, now, talk to each other. Let's get whatever is bothering you out in the open and work it out.
Oh, that's good. Go ahead.
I guess whenever I have friends that are in a relationship, and then they're both kind of coming to me to vent, and trying to get the right advice, but at the same time stay loyal to the other one. Say that right there has been like a couple of times I've been in that situation here recently.
Yeah, there's a proverb we already covered on that topic. Like one woman tears down her house and another one builds it. And I would say over the years, and not to single out women, men do this too, but over the years, there's been lots of experiences both Heather and I have had with other married couples where it comes into a spouse bashing kind of thing. And I would highly caution against that because you're tearing your relationship down. So if you're speaking ill of the other partner, remember you're a creator, you're going to create that. If you have an issue with your partner, you need to go with them directly. And, when you speak with friends, what typically happens is once you finally address it, you've vented, now you've poisoned the well with that person. And now that person never trusts your spouse again, and you've done it all, and it was your making of your own, right? And I've seen it happen and play out many times in 25 years of teaching in Bible studies. So that's definitely taking the dog by the ears when you're starting to do that kind of thing. That's a good point. I would say, kind of like discussed. We are called to be peacemakers, so mediating is a good term there. I would just caution you, make sure you're being wise about the time to mediate. If the argument is hot, people are hot, they're not gonna receive it. Right. I have 2 redheads, I have 4 adopted children, so I know exactly how that looks like. When a redhead is spun up, you're not gonna talk with them. You gotta wait for the tornado to stop turning before you can actually ration the person. Emotions have a way of taking over rational thinking. And we should seek understanding, not reaction. And if they're on reaction mode, you're not gonna get understanding. Okay, let's do 18 and 19.
Like a madman, he throws fire brands, arrows, and death. Is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I was only joking.
Okay, so here's the person, they have ill intents, right? They're throwing weapons, which are words, right? Words can be weapons. But they're doing it in the guise of humor, right? You've probably seen this person. They say something pretty awful and mean, and they go, "Oh, just joking," And the damage is already done, right? Once you've said it, and it's damaging. It's deceitful. It's evil. It shows the heart's intent. You can't pass it off as just a joke. And I had an example at work where there's this lady we work with, and she's very funny and boisterous, and all that. And she's a good sport about things. And they made an internet picture of her that was not very flattering, and she laughed at it at first, out of self-defense, not. But then that kind of egged it on. So then people carded, and it really hurt her, right? And, sometimes we have to be careful participating in that. So even if the person, laughs about it or something, we, probably should check in with that person and see how they're doing. Because sometimes it's easier to laugh with someone, they'll joke about somebody being fat, owning it and laughing about it, when they're really hurting, right? So just be careful there. We're supposed to be love to others, love then truth. Truth without love is a firebrand or an arrow. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. Let's go on to 20 and 21.
Where there is no wood, fire goes out. Where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. As charcoal is running coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious and kindle strife.
So, if you've ever had one of those people that stir, that always stirs people up, always having conflict, when they leave, the peace returns. So you're going to have to evaluate your life and see where you have stirs in your midst. We've talked about this. You need to protect your inner circle. So if you have somebody that's stirring things up all the time, you can still have them in your life, but they need to be out. Obviously we can't pick everybody we work with, everything, but we need to be able to have wisdom and discernment to know that they're that type of person, and we can't let them into our inner circle. What are the consequences if you're hanging around somebody like that?
Scripture says a little bit of yeast leavens the whole lump.
Yes.
So, in they come and they start spewing their yeast, everybody's gonna start picking up on that and they're gonna start acting the same.
Exactly, and it's gonna impact your peace. So God, John 10:10, gives us life and life abundantly. We can't have the abundant life if we're mired in strife. We weren't called for that. So if you've got somebody that's a strife teller, or gossiper, or that kind of stuff, and these people, you know, they normally come to you talking about a third party.
Yep.
But as soon as you leave, guess who the third party is? Right. So if someone's gonna say unpleasant things about someone else that's a third party, then they're gonna do the same towards you. That should be one of your signs. Go ahead, Jamie.
Just talking about this scripture right here. I don't like to talk about prison too much, that's my past life, but one person would come into a tank of like 50, sometimes 75 people, and there would be no politics going on at that moment, but that one person would divide the whole tank and make it racial, where everybody's walking on eggshells and stuff. So that's just something that kind of popped up. I mean, literally one person come in with a certain type of tattoos and energy and racism, and they can divide the whole thing. And the chaos could erupt at any moment while we're in there. It was just a terrible thing. We try to leave those guys out if we could, you know, before it started, because we've seen it way too many times.
Yeah. I would agree with that. We even saw that with, on Wednesday nights, if you've been coming, you know, we just went through this with Judas, right? Judas at the dinner, right? First at the Last Supper when he's betraying, and then there's strife, and then he leaves, and then all of a sudden Jesus is free to talk about love, and he calls them little children. He didn't say little children while Judas was there, because Judas wasn't one, right? But he had all the hallmarks. You know, we talked about that. Judas was one of the 12. He went out and cast out demons. He did everything. He was right there in with them. They all trusted him. They all went around, even when they said someone was going to betray him, they were saying, was it me? You know? They had no clue that Judas was that way at heart. So we have to be very discerning. Okay. Let's go on to 22. Who would like to read?
The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body.
Okay, I'm a redneck, I'll admit it, but trifles, I think, are those chocolate candies that are really, you know, fancy.
That's troubles.
Truffles, well, it's like trifles.
Truffles are, yeah.
That's what I think, at least that's what I correlate this. Maybe y'all can correct me, but they do taste good. But like those, if you eat too many of them, what happens? Yeah, you get a bellyache, right? And they're tasty at the moment, but boy, do they bring a bellyache. And so will that gossip. It's gonna come back and bite you. So you'd be better off pulling on a dog's ear. It'll heal quicker, and the dog will forgive you. The gossip part may not, right? It'll carry with you. So that's what this is worried about. And you know, in our culture, we have words for it, right? Like spill the tea. You know, tell me what's going on. You know, and it's because it's tasty, right? It's salacious. It's all that, but we a lot of times don't see the danger in it, and we don't realize the damage that could be done. We were talking this morning in the men's Bible study, but when y'all were a kid, did y'all ever play the telephone game? Y'all remember the telephone game? where you whisper in somebody's ear and you go around 5 or 10 people and then the last person tells it and it's totally different than when the first person started. That's a good illustration of tale bearing, right? Because it tends to change, you know. All you gotta do is talk with the fisherman, you know, about what he caught, right? By the time the third time he tells it, the fish is really big, right? So.
Oh, wow. That's all good stuff.
So, the tail bearing, you know, it's tasty at the moment, but it's gonna leave that bitter, it's like that scripture, I believe it's in Revelation, of wormwood, right? Where
Bitter.
it's gonna be bitter in your stomach. So, I think that's what we're driving at on that one.
Cody, it can easily go from gossip to bearing false witness.
Absolutely. Well,
Kind of like in line with the telephone game, how it started, it's not how it ended, but that's the story that's gonna get gossiped about and passed on, which may totally not be true.
and if you're in that loop, then you're participating in lying,
Yeah.
you're participating in all of
That's
that,
right.
right?
That's right,
And what does that do to our relationship with the Lord?
right.
Not to mention the relationship with others,
Right.
because we just covered that on Wednesday night. The new commandment is that we love, right?
Yes.
Well, you can't love and gossip at the same
That's
time.
right.
And then that's gonna affect your relationship with the Lord and your righteousness, because you have this sin. And then the sin is what? That's an invitation for spiritual attacks.
Right.
Because now you've opened up yourself to spiritual attacks. So now the enemy has got a foothold in the door. All because we participated in this.
Right.
So the question is when this happens, how do you address it? When someone comes to you with gossip, how do you address it?
How do you address it? You, say, talk to that person about it, maybe.
Yeah.
You just go up to them and have a private conversation. And if you need some mediation or something, maybe I can be there for you.
Yeah, most of the time, you know, when they come talking about a third party and you ask them, have you talked directly with that person? Most of the time they're gonna say no, okay?
Yeah.
And then you go, well, if you haven't, then would you like for me to mediate or put you two together? Because there may be a misunderstanding here.
That's right.
Or, you know, if this person has stumbled, then they need someone to help them up.
Right.
So don't you think that's important? And then depending on the person, they will either turn because they don't want to get involved and they just wanted to spread the gossip, or maybe they'll feel convicted. And the other benefit of doing that is they're not going to be quick to tell you gossip in the future, because they're going to know JD doesn't listen to gossip. He only deals directly with the person that's involved in it, right? So then a lot of these people want the reaction. That's the benefit, is the reaction. If you don't get the reaction, then you're gonna stop doing it. Okay. Let's go on to 23 and we'll kind of finish this section with 27. These are kind of all connected and we'll try to go through it here, but we're gonna switch topics slightly. It's all kind of on the same area, but somebody wanna read 23?
Smooth words may hide the wicked heart, just as a pretty glaze covers a clay pot.
I like that translation, because that translation is a little more accurate than the New King James. It was a little harder to follow. Earthenware, if you're, especially being a guy, earthenware, I don't think of pottery, right? But, you know, the pottery normally has a smooth glaze over it, which makes it shiny, but in the end it's really mud that was heated up, right? And he's saying this was silver dross. So the silver dross here is trying to say, like, you think there's silver there, but it's really mud and clay underneath. And that's how this person is presenting with their lips. So they're trying to sell you silver essentially through their words, but it's really clay. Okay? And they're being very deceptive. They're trying to disguise the motives. And we see this a lot, right? And we're going to kind of follow up with that theme on the next couple of verses. So go ahead and read 24 through 26.
He who hates disguises it with his lips, and lays up deceit within himself. When he speaks kindly, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness will be revealed before the assembly.
Okay, so we now got to the quote heart of the matter, right? And what's in his heart? 7 abominations. 7 is a word for completeness in the Bible. There's several words, numbers that mean certain things. Sometimes you'll see 10 as completeness as well, but 7 is completeness, almost perfection. You'll see it especially in the book of Revelation. It's full of 7s imagery. And so 7 here is indicating full abominations, like all of the abominations. And you see the hate, and he's disguising it, and he lays up with deceit. But the wickedness will be revealed in the assembly. Now, I didn't look it up in Blue Letter Bible, which I recommend for y'all, the original word, but the assembly there, more than likely in Hebrew, is the word synagogue. Okay, that's normally what they said. Is they even used it as a verb. It's to synagogue together, to assemble together. Okay, and sometimes people get this a little wrong, but the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament and all that, which the disciples used, including Jesus, the term for synagogue is actually ecclesia. Okay, so a lot of people seem to think, oh, this just means the church. No, it really meant the synagogue too. Okay, it's just the Greek word for it. But what this is saying is this guy with all this evil and deceit laid up in him is in the midst of the church, in the midst of us. So we don't think of people being full of abominations and evil. We think of that outside the church. But in this case, he's saying it's right here in the church. Okay, and we can't be naive about it, right? And we've seen a lot of that recently with pastors falling and, you know, lots of evil that is covered up, right? And that's kind of what this is saying. So the lips are pretending, you know, this one actually mentions Judas, you know, as one of those examples, which we just kind of walked through. But you're going to have to be careful. So the question here is, how do you identify these people like this that are, quote, in the assembly?
By their fruit.
Yes, I would say it'd be their fruit, their actions. You can't trust the words. Words lie. So we have to be able to see their actions. We've talked about this before. There's a congruence or an incongruence with people. If you're around them long enough, now sometimes that's harder with people that you're not around, but if you're around someone long enough, you're gonna see if their walk is matching their words. And if their walk is not matching their words, then they're living in deceit. They're living something that's a lie. And that should be a strong indicator of your level of trust and where you're gonna place them, because you don't want someone like that in your inner circle, right? Does that make sense? And some people, you know, maybe they're doing it ignorantly and maybe you can help them, but a lot of them, you know, may be doing it for other motives. Unfortunately, a lot of people go to church, but a lot of them don't go to church just to worship God and to get closer to themselves. They go for other motives. You know, I myself was there in 7th grade 7th or 8th grade, I think it was 7th grade, I didn't know anything. I grew up in a real house. We didn't go to church. I didn't know anything like that. But I did hear that the Methodist church had cute girls and they allowed dancing. So that was my criteria for going. So at that age, I determined I was a full-on Methodist, right? Because they had cute girls and they allowed dancing.
Okay.
So, you know, we all can go to church for the wrong reasons.
Absolutely.
There's people that go to church, especially in the Bible Belt here, because it's good for business. They get to establish relationships with people, right?
Yeah.
You know, or they're shopping for a spouse or something. When, you know, God may want you to have a spouse, but maybe that's, like we've talked about it before, that's step 4. We gotta work on you so you are a good spouse, so you don't run off the one that's good for you when you actually meet her, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so now we're on to 26 and 27.
Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him.
Okay, so this is sowing and reaping, right? So we've kind of laid out the process here, and then we've said that the ultimate of this is that it's gonna be self-ruinous, right? You're gonna try to ruin somebody else through deceit, through gossip, through all that, and eventually it's gonna come back on you. It's sowing and reaping. So the Bible Illustrator had a pretty good process here on 23 through 27. So hopefully I'm going to kind of try to walk us through this so we can better understand this and better see the process for twofold reasons. A, identifying it either in others or in ourselves if we get drawn into this process, right? So first is, it starts with the disguise, right? The lips are saying good things, so you're drawn in, right? Heather and I sometimes watch Netflix, and we watched a show over the weekend. I'm not sure if I recommend it, but it's a train wreck. It is somewhat entertaining, but it was Nature Boy is the name of it. And it's this black guy, and he's a cult leader, right? But he fits this exact thing. So he's an in-shape black guy, and he's doing these videos on YouTube in like Belize and Costa Rica and these nature places, and he starts with spirit, nature, and spirituality, and then, you know, and then he's asking for donations, and then pretty soon he's saying people, you know, leave this life, you know, come here, you know, and he does the whole racial thing, you know, melatonin, you know, we've got dark skin, we're melatonin, you know, nation, and he starts getting these people to come follow him. And eventually it turns, you know, and it turns into like a sex cult and the whole 9 yards and abuse, and he's now serving life plus 10, okay? But he went through years, like people were his quote followers, you know, and they never saw it because it started off innocent like this, you know, nature, beautiful shots of nature. He sounded eloquent, like all these people that lead cults. He was very charismatic, so it was easy to follow, but then he started, you know, like all of them, domination, abuse, all the other things. So it starts with good words, right? And then it becomes corrupt, right? So you see the corruptness start to come out, and a lot of us, and even when you watch this documentary, people say, well, that rubbed me wrong, but I still went ahead, you know? Sometimes we gotta, being wise and discerning is to, when you see those red flags, you gotta act on them. You can't just pass it by, because you're getting deeper and deeper in. Tell an example. We were yesterday we were working with the chainsaws, cut down this big tree, and you know how soupy and muddy everything is. Well, I had Hudson on the tractor, and he's pulling this with the chain, pulling the tree over the burn pile. Well, there's a little ditch right there. So of course he went right in the ditch with all the mud, you know. And I'm like, lay off the gas. And he's trying to lay off the gas. Well, what's it doing? It's just digging, right? And unfortunately, that's what we do, right? We just dig. We just think we can put on the gas and get out of the problem, right? And we're just digging it deeper, you know? It wasn't until I got Heather's Jeep and a chain to get the tractor out, right? Because, and that's what happens. You get into these situations and you start burning like this, and you're just digging the hole deeper. And what you really need is help. You need somebody to yank you out of that situation, right? And you have to have the awareness to say, hey, I gotta let off the gas. I'm making this problem worse, you know? Hopefully that illustration works. It's a little redneck illustration, but I am a redneck. And then he goes on to step 3. Step 3 is exposure. So how Nature Boy and that whole cult finally on the TV show got taken down was people started seeing all the warning signs, because the people in the cult couldn't see it. They're blinded, right? They're like that mower or the tractor. They're just spinning the tires and it's going deeper and deeper and hitting on the gas. But the people on the outside could see it, and then they started exposing the light. And then the police started getting called. And then he manipulated the police for a long time. And then finally, one person had the courage to escape, and then that broke the dam. But exposure is how these things get solved. God normally has a process, and God is light, so this darkness has to be exposed to the light. And normally we're very impatient, right? We want the situation solved. But like, for instance, the Epstein files, right? That's God showing the light. We're all wanting justice, I know I am, but the light has to be exposed. And a lot of times God works through people. So just like in that situation, you're now starting to see some of these survivors from Epstein that are actually having the courage to step up and say, okay, we will release the names, we will go on live, you know, and there's going to be justice eventually. It's just not in our time. And a lot of times it's just like in Joshua, where God gives us this to conquer, but he only gives us the land that we're willing to step in, right? And God gave us the dominion, so he doesn't cut us off and say, back up, I'm going to solve this. He says, no, I'm going to solve it through you. The scripture says, I'll put the enemies under your feet. So a lot of this is our lack of fortitude or trust in God to move forward. We get stifled with fear or other things, and we don't move forward. Does that make sense? Okay. Self-ruinous, right? So just like in that, you know, eventually people are going to come to justice. You're even starting to see it with Epstein. Like there's been several world leaders that have had to step down. Other things, it's just not going as quickly as we had hoped. And then the last thing he says is socially pernicious. And, you know, and this is going to get into the flattery thing, but, you know, especially in the age of the internet now, people have these platforms where they can do this deceit. And the deceit is so slick now, right? I mean, you have AI that can create a video, it can create images, it can create pictures. You know, there's like, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Project Bluebeam. Have y'all heard of that? It's part of the CIA documentation, but they actually used it in the Iraq War. One of them was called The Voice of God. You got a veteran here. I don't know if you've heard of that? But in the Iraq War, they were able to use this technology that does intracranial vibrations. So you can hear a voice inside your head that's not audible, right? So during the Iraq War, if you remember that Operation Desert Storm, I think is what the name of it was, but they just kind of rolled in. They went all the way to Iraq. And they almost got no resistance. That's because they used this technology. And in their own language, they spoke to the Iraqi soldiers. They said, Allah told you to set down your guns. And they believed it, right? Because they heard a voice inside their head that claimed to be Allah. So they set down their guns. And Project Bluebeam is a similar thing. If you've seen like the opening of the Olympics where they have like the whales in the sky and they do all that 3D, you know. Yeah, there's a term for it, but they'll do
Hologram?
what?
Hologram?
Yeah.
Yeah, holograms in the sky. That's the term I was looking for. So they do those holograms. Well, there's old documentation where they're planning, they have in their playbook to do holograms of aliens for like an alien invasion. They have it, one of them is to have Jesus, a big Jesus in the sky. So we as Jesus followers, we need to understand, you know, we need to understand this and not fall for it, right? So we have to be very cognizant of the enemy and their ways. And it's getting harder and harder, right? Okay. Let's go to flattery, which is verse 28.
A lying tongue hates its victims, flattering words cause ruin.
So the flattering, and this kind of goes into hypocrisy too, so we're going to kind of cover both here. But the flattering, the example we found was Haman in the Bible. If you remember Haman with Esther and Mordecai, right? Haman used flattery in front of the king with ill intent to kill all of the Jews. And it wasn't until Esther uncovered it and exposed it at her risk of her own life in front of the king that it transformed everything. But his flattery was all planned. You know, he had the gallows built to hang Mordecai. And then he ended up being hung on the gallows he was built, you know? And that's how the flattery happens. Now, what makes us so susceptible to flattery? Pride. Pride is sown in our nature, right? We want to hear good things. But being wise and being discerning means you've got to look at who's telling you those good things. Is that person in your inner circle? Have they also told you negative things before honestly to improve you? Are those genuine compliments? Or if not, there may be a motive behind the flattery, right? We have to be able to discern that, right? Because that is a way that the enemy uses. It's as old as the garden to appeal to our pride, right? And it's hardwired in this flesh, so we're very susceptible to it. And the hypocrisy, I'll read just a little bit from McGee here. Hypocrisy is found in Christian circles. We need to recognize it. There is no use covering this up. There is probably no place in the world that is covered up as much as church. We try to act as if there are no wrong there. We think that if we ignore it, it'll go away. If we feel defeated if anyone mentions that there's hypocrisy. We feel that our in ourselves are defeated, and we acknowledge that in our hearts there's a root of bitterness sometimes. Christians must face up to these sins. You know, hypocrisy is wild, especially in the church. It's probably more so in the church. As far as hypocrisy goes, this has been the best church I've been to. But it can still surface here, and especially as Bonham grows and we get more, you know, people that aren't as forthcoming. But yeah, you know, I taught at Cottonwood Creek Baptist with 3,000 members on Sunday. And I noticed in my teaching there, I noticed that, and maybe this is just surfacing, but I noticed that at Cottonwood they kind of had an unwritten dress code. Like all the guys wore like khaki button downs. They were all, you know, the women kind of dressed up. And I noticed that when I dressed that way, people treated me differently. Like I'd go to teach and they go, oh, you know, they would assume that I'm a preacher's kid and that I just grew up, you know, and hadn't sinned and all this. And, you know, there was an assumption with that dress. There was a hypocrisy. There was a mask that you put on. So I started being the odd duck. I showed up and teach in jeans every Sunday because I noticed that I was treated differently if I did not dress up. So, and it made the people more authentic around me. So, you know, maybe it was just me, but there's quite a few churches like that. If you've been to Prestonwood Baptist in Plano, those people dress to the nines, you know, and there's a certain comfort level when you put on the church suit, you know, then you kind of put on the attitude that goes with that, you know, and we have to protect against that, you know. And I know dress is not the important thing. There are people that dress just to dress for God, not for others, but unfortunately there are a lot of people that take advantage of that, dress for the wrong reasons, and it's easy to get caught up in that mentality. So we've got to be genuine, not fake like that, you know. Has anybody else seen that or felt that, or am I alone? Okay. Any thoughts on this?
Love the lesson.
Okay.
I understood pretty much all of it.
Okay.
About 90% of it.
You want to kill the camera?